Sally Helgesen, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation on conscious visibility. Let's dive right in. Sally, I'd love to actually begin with the why of visibility, which I know is something you talk about in both of your books, which I've read cover to cover, How Women Rise as well as Rising Together. And what I'd love to know at the outset is what would you say to a woman who right now is thinking, why do I need to make an extra effort to build my visibility? I'm sincere, I'm committed in the way I do my work. Why can I not just keep my head down, focus on doing great work, and let my work speak for itself?
Because your work usually doesn't speak for itself unless you speak for it as well. In my experience, great careers, satisfying careers, are built on three legs. One is expertise. So that is being able to do your job well, skillfully. The other is connections, who you know and who you're connected with. But the third is visibility, and it is absolutely essential in order to become recognized for what you contribute. And the reason I always say to women who may be reluctant to do this or think, I think if I do a great job, it will be noticed or it should be noticed, is that if you don't find a way to bring attention to what you contribute, you will feel under recognized, you will be undervalued, and over time, you will disengage, even from a job you love. So, in order to prevent that, you have got to put some effort and some time into cultivating visibility, conscious visibility, as you said, intentional visibility. You have to have a strategy for getting noticed.
Absolutely. And incidentally, recently, in the research we had done, asking women why they leave organizations, whether it's leaving the workforce altogether or moving from one organization to another, the number one reason that came up is feeling undervalued.
Exactly, exactly. And it is within your control to not be undervalued. But in order to do that, you have to find a way to let people know what you're contributing and become visible. That you don't have and you guess what? They'll go to another job, and if they don't have a strategy there for becoming visible, then they'll come to feel undervalued there as well.
Yes. One idea that I really like that you and Marshall Goldsmith share and talk about in Rising Together is the authenticity trap. And I'd love for you to say a little more about that because in my work, I have seen this word authenticity come up and cited as a reason for not doing something that might make you feel uncomfortable. For example, I have heard women say, oh, but talking about my work and my accomplishments feels very self-promotional. It doesn't feel authentic. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say one thing. Anytime we practice a new behavior, it feels uncomfortable. It feels risky. And of course, it feels inauthentic because we haven't done it before. So I think we've gotten a little bit overly invested sometimes in the idea that we have to be authentic in every possible situation and occasion. Marshall, who did not, by the way, collaborate with me on Rising Together, he did on How Women Rise, but I did Rising Together by myself, but always influenced by Marshall. And in his wonderful book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, he calls what I call the authenticity trap an excessive need to be me. And I love that phrase. So we don't, I think that it's more helpful to think in terms of being a professional and reaching our full potential rather than am I being authentic in every single situation? Because if we are over focused on that, we'll never try anything new. We won't change and grow because it won't feel authentic to us at the start.
The other thing, Sally, that I've seen gets in the way that I know you talk about in Rising Together is managing perceptions. And as you said, it is a question that keeps coming up. And I have heard women wonder and ask, okay, fine, I can put myself out there, but then how do I stop people from looking at me as someone who's being too pushy? Or how do I stop my colleagues from thinking of me as a threat? So what would you say to that?
I would say two things. The first thing I would say is your priority should be doing a great job and becoming recognized for what you're doing, rather than what anybody might think of you. So, of course, none of us want to offend people or, be seen as overly pushy or what this, that, or the other. But we can't control what other people think. So if we're putting all our energy into trying to manage people's perceptions, we are putting our energy into something that lies outside of our control. Maybe we remind someone of their ex-wife. Maybe we remind them of their mother or their mother-in-law or their daughter or daughter-in-law. We can't control that. They may be reacting based upon that. So we don't want to put our energy into that which we cannot control. We want to put it into what we're being intentional about. But the second thing is this: people change their mind. As we practice a new behavior or as people get to know us, they will change their mind about us. They'll think, at first I thought she was being very pushy. I was surprised. It wasn't how I thought she was. I wasn't used to it. But now I really see that she's made some great points there. And she's a very warm, approachable person. So I realized I, need to let that thinking go. I use an example in Rising Together that has always shaped my thinking about this. And that is when I was working in the 1980s in corporate communications. There weren't very many women. And in one of the companies I was part of, I went to a meeting. I was the only woman there, and I was the most junior person in the room. And as the guys were talking about a challenge we were facing, I shared an idea that I had about it. And no one responded at all. No one said anything. So I thought, okay, I guess it wasn't a bad idea. I guess it wasn't a good idea. But as I was walking out afterwards, my boss's boss came up behind me and said, well, I see you aren't afraid to share your opinion, in a really nasty way. And I don't know why, but what I said was, no, I'm not. I didn't say, oh, I'm so sorry. Maybe I shouldn't have spoken. I didn't do that. But I also didn't say, I have a perfect right to speak up. I just said, no, I'm not. And what was interesting was about a month later, I happened to be in the hallway and I heard that man talking to a colleague in an office. And what he was saying was this: you know what I like about Sally is she's not afraid to speak her mind. In other words, he got used to me. He got used to me. And we want to give people a chance to get used to us. And we don't want to be trapped by perceptions that they might have had because of old behaviors that we practiced. So I believe that women can benefit a lot by not putting too much energy into trying to manage people's perceptions. Guess what? Men don't. They don't. And it gives them a lot more energy.
So true. And I think the more and more, both individually and collectively as women, we do speak up more, do put ourselves out there more. That is how we are bringing about a wider cultural shift. And like you said, giving people a chance to adjust their thinking and their perceptions around this new norm. So absolutely, I fully agree with you. Sally, one of coming to your book, How Women Rise, I know you talk about 12 internal barriers that women face, ways in which they might be getting in their own way, if you will. So when it comes to visibility, what would you say is the biggest barrier that comes up that we can be more mindful of?
I think the internal barrier that's in How Women Rise that is most related to the issue of visibility. Well, there are two of them, but one is really direct, and that is expecting others to spontaneously notice and value our contributions. And this is basically the idea of almost outsourcing to other people the job of positioning ourselves to be visible. It's rarely successful. And it's often very disappointing because I've heard women say, I've said it myself, I thought that they'd notice that what a good job I did, how much effort I put into preparing that report or delivering that paper, whatever it is. And guess what? People don't notice that much. They just don't. They're thinking of their own work, they're thinking of their own lives. And unless you have a way to draw their attention to it, they just don't notice that much. So it is a really bad, not, I don't want to say bad, but it's an ineffective approach to hope that people notice what you do or to expect it. I believe people should notice if I do great work. Well, yeah, they probably should, but they don't. So that's the primary one. But there's another one, and that is overvaluing expertise, because that's where we expect that, doing a great job will lead us to what we want. It'll lead us to a promotion, it'll lead us to recognition, it'll lead us, to being acknowledged for what we do. And it often doesn't. It's one part of the puzzle, but as I said, great careers built on three legs: expertise, visibility, and connection.
Yeah, absolutely. So now coming to the how of visibility. Sally, you've been doing this work for over 35 years, I believe, and you've had the opportunity to coach women leaders from around the world. I'd love to know, in your work, what have you found are the top 2 or 3 strategies, proven strategies, that any woman can adopt to make herself more visible?
Well, first of all, it's really helpful. I mean, women are often uncomfortable talking about their achievements because they've seen it done badly, or they've seen somebody being obnoxious and they can't imagine themselves being like that. So they just kind of back off. One of the top things that I recommend for women is to use what I call the language of contribution. And that is, whether talking about achievement, I did this, I got that, I was recognized for this, or the client told me I was X. To talk about it really in a language of contribution. I was able to contribute this, I was able to contribute that. I felt that the contribution that I made was this. Because when you use that kind of language, you really almost embed it in the larger context and acknowledge that it's not just you. You contributed rather than necessarily achieved. So if you're uncomfortable talking about achievements, I really strongly recommend talking about contribution. The other thing is not to think that it's an either or between you or your team. This is one of the most common things I hear from women. Well, I don't want to talk about what I did because we do our work in teams and we're supposed to be, team oriented, and, this saying they have, there is no I in teams, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, fine. But what we want to do is it's not an either or. We can talk about what our team did, but we always want to talk about what our contribution is as well. And this is another way in which using the language of contribution can be so, so helpful. It is, my team was able, we had these results. This was the response from the client. This was the, amount of work we brought in, or whatever, whatever your purpose is on your team. We were able to be really successful here. My contribution was. That's very useful, because on one hand, you're acknowledging the team, but you're always sure to add what you contributed, because after all, you did contribute something. You were part of the team. And for some reason, a lot of women have gotten stuck with the idea that you either talk about yourself or your team. There's no way to talk about both. It's a both and, it's not an either or. So those are very, very, very helpful things to do. And finally, let me just also say that if you are not accustomed to talking about this, your contributions, you need to think about how you can take a risk to do it. It'll feel risky. It will feel uncomfortable. You might practice with somebody beforehand, get some trusted person that you work with, or even a friend, and say, I need to get better at doing this. How about this? Here was something I was thinking of saying. How does that sound? I want to do a good job. And then once you've said it, just say it. Don't keep, well, that may not be important or whatever, just say it, let it lie there.
I love the language around contribution. I think that's so helpful and powerful, because when you're speaking in terms of contribution, it's also, what it also indicates is that you're very mindful of what is the larger goal that you are contributing to, which really positions you as a more effective and strategic leader as well. And your point on sharing the spotlight, if you will, with your team also, I think makes it so much more manageable, especially for women, because we do like that collective sense, and talking about we instead of I. So I love both of those points. Sally, you wear so many hats. You are an author, you're a speaker, you're a facilitator and coach. In your own journey, what have you found has been that one thing that has helped you the most in building a visible brand for yourself?
Well, I think that what's helped me most is really being very clear about what my mission and purpose is. And I have I've done a lot of different things, so it's easy to feel kind of all over the map. When you do a lot of different things, well, how does this relate to this? How does this relate to that? But I have been clear about what my purpose is, what my contribution to the world is, for at least 30 years. And it is very simple. It's to help women to recognize, articulate, and act on their greatest strengths, and to help organizations become more inclusive places that value the contributions women and others who may have been outside the leadership mainstream can make. So that's basically it. And that helps me to evaluate various opportunities, because I can say, how does that further the mission? This is not something I made up. This is something I really got from my mentor, Frances Hesselbein, who was one of the most intentional leaders I have ever known. And she would always say over and over and over, manage to the mission. Know what your mission is, and then everything, all your decisions will be fairly easy. And that's what I found. I grabbed that from Frances. It's been with me for 30 years. The mission hasn't changed. The intention for whatever the project changes. My intention right now is to bring as much visibility to Rising Together as I can, but that is in the service of those other two of that chief mission of mine.
Yeah, it's so helpful to know one's purpose and have that as a North Star for all the decisions that you may be making. That's wonderful. Switching gears now to organizations and speaking of visibility, do you think it the onus of making ourselves more visible as women lies mostly on us, or do you believe there's a meaningful role that organizations can also play in amplifying the contributions and work of women? And if so, what would that look like?
Well, I absolutely believe that. We can't rely on it. You know, an organization can be very good at doing that and then get a new leadership team in, and it's not. You know, those things change often in response to what's going on. So we can't just rely on it. But certainly there are many, many things women that organizations can do. And one of them is helping men have a better understanding of what women can contribute and what some of the internal barriers are that get in their way. I know from having written How Women Rise and having written it with Marshall that there were so many of those internal barriers that men say, oh, that helps me understand why she didn't do this, or that helps me understand why I told, recommended this woman for a new position and she said, oh, I'm not quite ready yet. They said, understanding these things is really, really helpful. So I think there's a lot more organizations can do to help educate men about what some of the things that stand in the way of women really are. Because since there has been a lot of progress, and there certainly has, I mean, anybody who's been around, well, 35 years I've been doing this, but I've been in the workforce for over 50. So I've seen a tremendous amount of positive change. But often, men who aren't immersed in it will think, oh, well, there are plenty of women here who are doing really well. This work is done. So I think that would be helpful. And then I think that creating a culture in which women have greater comfort to be themselves, to share the spotlight, to demonstrate generosity, to communicate across levels, to build relationships that are, sort of friendships and professional relationships, all of those things that women do very well. Creating cultures in which women are really comfortable, that's the number one thing organizations can do.
Absolutely. The other thing that you talk about in your book that I think is also quite insightful is when you talk about the confidence competence conundrum. Because as much as women are faulted for not being confident enough to put themselves out there, equally what is important is also recognizing that it's not just the lack of confidence that could be a problem. We equally need to be mindful of the perils of overconfidence, especially when it doesn't match up with confidence. So please say a little more about that.
Well, it's really interesting. There's a fellow who's been very influential in my thinking, Thomas from Music Tomorrow, who is at London School of Business and a couple other places. And his whole research base shows, according to him, the biggest leadership challenge is that companies do a very poor job, these are his words, of identifying overconfidence in men. Because women are rarely overconfident. If they are, it's like Elizabeth Holmes, who started that Theranos, and it's really kind of a scam. But women are rarely overconfident. Women rarely go into a situation and say, I got it, I can handle it, don't worry about it. The details will take care of themselves. I'm the savior here. There are men who do this all the time. Go to Silicon Valley, you see them coming out of the woodwork. that overconfidence, that, I am the answer. I have extraordinary skills that may be completely untethered to their actual competence. And when you get that situation, organizations will undervalue competence. You hear it all the time. She was merely competent. No, competence is a big deal. So it's very important, I think, and Music Tomorrow says that one of the best things that organizations can do for women and for men who are not overconfident, but who are competent, is to learn to recognize how overconfidence manifests. And one thing that I think is really important is that women have been urged to be confident, as if this is something you can just tell someone, be confident. You've got to stand up and be confident. It's very hard to be confident when you know you're fully competent and your competence isn't really valued. So, that's a lot to put on people. And people don't just become confident. Your confidence needs to be rooted in your own expertise, in your own competence, your ability to do the job. So on one hand, it's an organizational task to recognize that there's nothing mere about confidence. It is extremely important. And the other thing is for women to have more confidence in their own competence and recognize how valuable a resource that is, and be able to talk about it.
Yes, yes. Sally, when you look at the future world of work and the future of leadership in particular, what role do you see women playing in that world? I'd love to know how you see women showing up in the future world of leadership.
What I have noticed watching this up close for the last 35 years is that women have really redefined how organizations, not all the time and not every organization, but in general, how we perceive excellence in leadership. When I got started in this field, a terrific leader was considered somebody who was the toughest, meanest boss. Well, he's an SOB, but he gets results. And often those results were very, very short term because the people in those organizations tended to be fairly miserable. And their talents, if they were in any way unorthodox, were not valued, and they were often hounded out. But that was considered outstanding leadership back in the 80s. And what I believe is that model began to change, and change for a number of reasons, having to do with technology. But to me, the chief reason it changed was because of the entrance into women in large numbers into the workforce, and they're beginning to achieve positions of power and influence. I'm not saying every woman is a wonderful leader. We've all seen and probably worked for women who are not. But in general, what women contribute and what they value in organizations has come to be the dominant way we define excellence. So it's a big, big change. And when I look forward, I see that continuing. More and more women are rising to high positions. There are fewer structural and cultural barriers. And I would also suggest that the internal barriers are becoming less of a problem as we move along. So I foresee women having far more influence and authority. And I foresee that continuing to change how we perceive excellence in leadership as something that's more inclusive, more oriented toward listening rather than telling, more collaborative, more skillful at motivating people, and with a greater recognition of the importance of motivation to creating cohesive cultures and teams.
And bringing in more compassionate and mindful leadership as well. I would add, which is something we talk a lot about at Genomics. Sally, on that extremely positive and optimistic note, I think we can conclude this conversation. I want to thank you for joining us for this conversation. Your work is so powerful, continues to be so relevant and so impactful. So thank you for doing the work that you do, and here's wishing you all the very best.
Oh, thank you, Bhavna. It was been such a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.